We're back on OpenLine. Dr. Beverly Moran, law professor over at Vanderbilt, is kind enough to spend an hour with us tonight and help us kind of break all this down. You see on the screen, we're talking about the Senate's Democrats' billionaire tax plan, and all of this stems, Dr. Moran, from President Biden's plan, his what they call the human infrastructure plan, which is a lot of different social programs that he would like to invest in, and obviously it comes at a price. And the opposition, during a time when, you know, we have rising national debt and inflation, they're saying we can't afford it. So people are coming up with ways, and there's been a lot of studies with the Congressional Budget Office of just how expensive will something like this be in the long run. So there's a lot of back and forth, but we know that we're going to need to raise some revenues. And this takes us back to an issue that I know you have studied and are really interested in. Our viewers may have heard through these debates the term either income inequality or economic inequality. How do we, first of all, define those terms before we can even kind of dive into the details? What is economic inequality?
Income inequality, the way that it's generally presented in the United States is based on tax returns. So the federal government, the Treasury Department takes all the tax returns and divides it into fifths. You know, the lowest quintile, the highest quintile, and the three in between. And what we've seen since the 1980s is that the amount of income that people earn who are in like the bottom four quintiles seems, when adjusted for inflation, you know, over time, to have been fairly flat since 1980. Whereas in the top quintile, particularly in the top 1%, there's a very steep rise. So the difference between the wealthiest people and the poorest people in 1980 was smaller than the difference between the wealthiest people and
the gap here is getting larger. So the question then is, and this is for the politicians I know, is to kind of look at the system and look at the people who are kind of stuck and not seeing, for whatever reason, not seeing opportunities to move up to the next income bracket and, you know, improve their standard of living. While, like you said, you look at the data from the IRS and other people are moving upward at a quicker and larger trajectory, right?
Yes, and what happened was that when that started to happen, people started to ask the question that you're asking: why? Why is that happening? And that then started people becoming interested in differences in wealth. And it's much harder to track differences in wealth than it is differences in income, because people don't have to report their wealth annually the way they do their income. But through a series of measures, mostly through the census, and we all know that every 10 years there's a census, but between those 10 years, there are different studies that the government does that become part of the census. And what happened was, as people started looking at the income gap, they started to realize that a lot of it was driven by the wealth gap.
Right.
Because what happens is that you can have two families and they can have the same income. I mean, to make it easy, let's say, well, you have a spouse who's staying home, you have another spouse who's working as a fireman, a police officer, you know, someone on that level. And everything is going along fine, and then something happens. One of the spouses dies or becomes ill, or one of the children becomes ill. And all of a sudden there's a tremendous amount of expenses, or there's a sudden drop in income. And what you see is that the difference between those two families, where they seem to be the same, becomes huge if one of them has a house and the other doesn't, or if one of them has equity in their house and the other doesn't,
Right.
or if one of them has a house and a pension, or anything that tides you over, because most Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So when you have any sort of a blow, someone destroys the car,
Right,
or
right.
It just can really wreck a family.
In an instant. Yeah, in an instant, like you said. And like with COVID, we've seen, huge medical bills, things that people, just regular everyday working folks who are trying real hard to put a little money away to save for retirement or college or whatever, and then this just wipes them out. Absolutely wipes them out. So that's when kind of the government and these social safety net is supposed to kind of click in to help people out in a time of need. And of course, this is when it gets political, and the right and the left and everyone argues about what is the role, how big should it be, and that's how we get to this President Biden's plan. Overall, where, if you're monitoring this, do you think this plan will finally get passed? I know there are Senate moderates still kind of waiting. There's Senator Manchin in West Virginia, Senator Sinema in Arizona. They're both Democrats. President Biden needs their votes. You've got progressives on the other hand, who are really they'd like to see it even larger. Where does it stand right now?
I think that, I'm not an insider. I have the same information you have.
Yeah.
So it seems as if the plan is getting smaller and less effective. I was personally astonished that the prescription drug part of the plan is not going through, because from the reports, it seemed that would save the government money, not cost the government money. Other than that, if I had to bet, I would bet that something gets passed.
Something,
maybe not.
And I know President Biden, who is no stranger to politics, is probably trying to tell some of the progressives who are obviously really wanting to get something effective passed, has to tell them, hey, we don't have that much of a majority, and we need to take what we can get and fight another day, move on, and try to do more later. And it can be a frustrating process, no doubt about it. But again, back to the whole tax the rich. First of all, how do we even define who's rich or who's wealthy? Where is that bar? Do we even know? It depends on the plan, right? And it depends on whether we're talking about, like you mentioned, income. There's some very wealthy people who don't actually get an income like you and I do, a paycheck. They are maybe living off of investments or a trust, or a large chunk of wealth where they're just drawing some interest, right?
Or borrowing. That's the argument that's made for these unrealized gains, because on the one hand, people with property are saying, how can you tax me on property when we really don't know what the value is? That was the argument that Elon Musk was making when he said, well, I should just sell 10% of my stock, and then we'll really know what it's worth, and and I'll pay my taxes, and people can be satisfied with that. But the response is, if it's worth so much that you can have a billionaire lifestyle off of borrowed funds that you use this wealth as collateral for, it's not the same as gambling. It really is a value that should be harvested for all of society, and not just held on for one person or one family.
Sure. All right.
I would actually be interested in knowing what your audience thinks of the idea of taxing the rich.
We're going to take a break, and I was just going to say that out there. What do you think about the long-time push that the rich, the line goes, are not paying their fair share? What does that mean? We're going to dive into that. We'd love to hear from you right after this.